One of the very first things a player does when they pick up a controller is figure out how to move their character. While it's pretty much a given that the left stick or the D-pad will be the main interface for this, possibly with a jump or a run button thrown in for good measure, there can sometimes be a lot to learn and master around momentum, chaining together moves, and so on. In fact, the genre of platforming games is entirely built around creating interesting movement challenges, and the exact tuning of a game's movement mechanics can have drastic effects on how it feels to play. To see just how much of a difference this tuning can make, we can compare two SNES platformers. In Super Mario World, Mario takes a little bit of time to accelerate and build momentum, and also a bit of time to slow down, which means that forward planning and a run-up is sometimes required for larger jumps. But on the whole, I think it's safe to say that the controls of this game are responsive and make it easy to improvise and quickly react to things. The scrolling screen is key in this regard because it allows the player to advance as quickly as their skills will allow. Compare all of that to Prince of Persia, where movement takes place in a grid-based layout, and the safest way to progress is one tile at a time, carefully planning your route in advance, screen by static screen. In Prince of Persia, what would have been a simple jump in a Mario game becomes a nerve-wracking leap that requires careful preparation and setup. We can see the same thing in 3D by looking at Super Mario 64 and Tomb Raider. One has responsive and low committal controls, the other requires you to do a 5-step checklist before you even think about attempting a jump. I think you get the idea. Despite all of these games being about jumping between platforms and avoiding obstacles, the difference in controls and movement mechanics are so great that many would say they don't even belong in the same genre. While the modern standardization of control schemes has removed a lot of the experimentation around movement mechanics that we saw in the early days of 3D, the question of how do I move remains an open one, and for developers who don't take the answer for granted, there's plenty of potential left untapped. Jusant is a game that's all about movement, but the way it asks the player to move is so fresh and distinct that it almost feels wrong to call it a platformer and burden it with all the baggage that comes with that term. It has a jump button, but even that feels vestigial and doesn't see a lot of use, and the reason for that is because Jusant is a game about climbing between platforms, not jumping. Climbing is a type of movement that's been represented in AAA games for some time now, with a couple of different lines of attack. What comes to mind first for me is the Uncharted Tomb Raider approach, where you hold forward on the controller and occasionally press A while your character makes death-defying leaps between surfaces covered in white paint. I trust it goes without saying that I find this incredibly boring. To my memory, this sort of climbing started with Assassin's Creed, and when it was new enough to be impressive on a technical level, it was truly mind-blowing. I'll give it credit for that. But by the end of a playthrough, it became starkly clear just how brainless and bare bones it was. In their defense, more recent AAAs have attempted to shake up this dull formula with additions like the grappling hook in Uncharted 4, and I'd say this does succeed in making climbing slightly more interesting, or at least in making you press another button on the controller when the big icon on the screen tells you to. But I think it's undeniable that these climbing scenes are very often more concerned with spectacle than with offering a complex gameplay scenario for the player to bite into. The other approach to climbing that I think has been influential is the strain pioneered by Breath of the Wild, where any surface is fair game, but you're limited by a stamina wheel that puts a cap on how much distance you can cover. Where this really succeeds is in blowing wide open the linearity of the other method, as you truly can go anywhere, provided that you have the stamina or the problem-solving ability to plot a course there. And naturally this means that it could only ever work in an open-world game. Obviously it would completely break a more linear game like Uncharted. This freeform climbing does add a sort of meta-level complexity to Zelda, because it turns climbing into one tool among many that the player can deploy to navigate or solve problems, but the actual act of climbing itself is still no more complex than holding forward on the controller. Surely there's something developers can do to make a game where climbing is interesting and compelling for its own sake. And that brings us finally back to Jusant, which takes ideas from both of these existing camps and clips its carabiner somewhere in the middle to see how high it can go. The single-sentence pre-spoiler warning summary is that Jusant is a pretty damn good game, and it brings a couple of innovations to the table that make for a really enjoyable first playthrough and an easy recommendation if you like platformers or movement-based games. In an age of overly long, repetitive and time-wasting open-world slop games, I have a huge amount of respect for a tightly paced 5-hour experience that tries some new ideas and attempts to trim out the filler, which is exactly what Jusant provides. Putting on my critiquing hat, there are a handful of flaws I could point out, and I will, but the predominant theme of my criticism is that the devs could have gone even further with the ideas that are already present in the game, which is surely a sign that they're moving in a very positive direction. There is enough in Jusant already to make it a satisfying experience that's well worth the price of admission, but it's brushing against something so much greater that I still can't help but feel just a little disappointed, particularly with the last couple of chapters. And here is where I'm going to place the spoiler warning, because I think I've said enough for you to work out whether Jusant is a game you'll want to play or not. If it sounds like the kind of thing you might enjoy, then come back after playing it to watch the rest of this video. Jusant begins with a short cutscene showing your character reaching the base of an impossibly high tower of rock in the desert. There's no time wasted on narrative justification because there's none necessary. As a player, all you need to know is that you're down here and you want to be up there, so get moving. This trust in the player to be self-motivated, and the trust it shows in the gameplay being good enough to hold their attention alone, didn't go unnoticed for me, and it's something I highly appreciate. I'll be returning to that thought later on, but for now let's dig into how the gameplay actually works and how Jusant builds up its stack of movement mechanics. We'll start where the game does, with the hand-over-hand basics. Approaching a set of handholds on a wall, you can grab on using the triggers, each one corresponding to a different hand's grip. The left stick controls your free hand, which extends slightly to let you know there's another hold within range, so there's never any doubt about whether you can reach or not. It's crucial for any movement system to nail the fundamentals, and Jusant easily passes that test. Climbing like this is satisfying and intuitive, and once you've got the rhythm down, you can scramble up surfaces remarkably quickly. Where these basic controls shine most for me is when you're ascending a man-made structure, and it really feels like you're improvising your way across a surface that wasn't necessarily meant to be climbed. Ironically, it's the rock handholds that feel more artificial and gamey, as the level designer's presence is felt more obviously when two outcrops are just the right distance apart for you to reach between. For the most part, it's natural and intuitive to see which parts of a wall can and can't be used as handholds, and believe it or not, this effect is achieved without slapping white paint over everything. Just saying. In fairness, this is surely easier for Jusant to pull off because of its simplified art style, and would be far more difficult in a AAA game that's going for realistic visuals, but still I think it's worth pointing out. When you have to fill your game's world with pointless clutter just to maintain the illusion of realism, so much so that the actually interactable objects have to be artificially highlighted to separate them from the noise, surely that's a sign that your game is getting too visually messy. The only time I struggled with readability in Jusant was in a spot near the end, where the path forward was along some handholds on the rock ceiling above me, which made them harder to see. When this happened at earlier points, the camera subtly nudged me upwards and drew my attention to the ceiling, but that didn't happen here, and I wasted a few minutes backtracking and thinking I'd missed something. And just quickly while I'm on the subject, it seems to me that climbing across ceiling handholds would be incredibly hard in real life, but in game it's no different in terms of controls from normal climbing. This seems like a missed opportunity to me. But anyway, minor gripes aside, Jusant's basic movement mechanics lay a solid groundwork for building on, so let's move one level up and see what the devs stacked on top. You've probably noticed the stamina bar that appears on screen while climbing, and it works pretty much exactly as you would expect, draining as you move along a wall, with a big chunk disappearing when you make a jump, which is another thing you can do, by the way. At any point during a climb, you can stop and press a button to rest your arms, which will partly refill your stamina, but it doesn't completely come back until you get your feet on solid ground again. I presume that when you run out of stamina, you lose your grip and fall, but I don't know because it never happened to me in my 2 playthroughs of the game. I've concluded that that isn't really the point though. The point is to put you under a slight and very forgiving time pressure, but a pressure all the same, and to force you to stop and rest periodically, and sometimes strategically, and it gives you just enough of an extra thing to worry about that I think it mostly succeeds at what it's trying to do. It's a shame there wasn't a way to convey your stamina level without resorting to a bar on the screen, but I can let this go because I'm almost certain the devs aren't fully happy with it either. They must have tried a few different ideas here and then fallen back on a stamina bar because nothing was as clear and readable as that. The final mechanic that's present from the start of the game is the climbing rope, which serves a few different functions and for my money is the most innovative feature of Jusant. First of all, like stamina, the rope has a maximum length, which makes it another limiting factor that restricts how far you can climb from your starting anchor point. But once again, this almost never caused me any trouble during my playthroughs. Quick shout out to the intuitive way the remaining length is conveyed, by changing the colour of the rope rather than by adding another bar or meter to the screen. In addition to the anchor point at the start of your climb, you can also stick pitons into the wall anywhere you like, which work as a sort of custom checkpoint system, as well as allowing you to swing your rope from wherever you choose to place them. This sort of rope swinging physics has been present in the AAA space for a while now, so it's not impressive in and of itself, but Jusant's addition of letting the player place their own anchor points wherever they like feels like a total revelation, and it easily carries the first half of the game. I will say, however, that it was slightly annoying to be constantly reminded by the UI to place anchors throughout a climb, as if I was playing the game wrong by not using them as checkpoints. That aside, sticking a piton in a spot of your choosing, using it to lower yourself down the wall you were just climbing up, and then swinging or running over to your goal is incredibly satisfying, and more so because it's usually not scripted or dictated by button prompts. It's just the player using their freeform toolset to solve problems, and that is far and away the most interesting and enjoyable part of playing Jusant, or any other movement-based game for that matter. It's for that reason that I find these fixed swinging grapple points so jarring and disappointing. In a game that usually allows the player total freedom in where they place their rope, these grapple points feel like an unfortunate concession to linearity. I've used the word intuitive a couple of times in this video, and I hope I've made it clear by now why it's so important for a game like this. The more intuitive and reflexive you can make your movement controls, the better, and every time the devs have to resort to putting a button prompt on the screen is a failure in that regard as far as I'm concerned. There are times when these prompts help point the way towards the exit, which also feels a bit like a design cheat to me, but in cases where the path forward is more obvious, it would have been far more interesting and liberating to let the player choose where to throw the rope themselves. In a similar vein to the grapple spots, there are automatic anchor points at the base of every climbing route, which makes sense next to well-travelled routes outside, but not so much when climbing up the ruins of a settlement in the tower's interior. I'll admit that this is a slightly pedantic criticism, but these anchor points feel unnecessary to me when one of the game's main mechanics is the ability to place anchors wherever the player likes. If the anchors are there to show the player where they need to start their climb, then we're straight back to the white paint problem of readability again, and I just think that there's got to be a better way than patronisingly removing control and responsibility from the player like this. Of course, there's one more reason why these automatic anchor points exist, and it's so that every climb can begin with the player's rope forcibly attached to something. Because it's impossible to climb without a rope, and it's impossible to detach your rope until you're on solid ground, this means that any misjudged leap will result in you dangling from your anchor point rather than falling to your death, with the ultimate intended effect being that Jusant is a game where it's impossible to die or see a game over screen. I think this was a good choice, and it fits the game's tone well. You might say that the knowledge that it's impossible to die removes the tension from a dangerous climb, but I don't think that's necessarily true, and in any case Jusant isn't a particularly difficult game to begin with. From a gameplay perspective, falling and being sent back to wherever your rope is anchored is almost identical to a traditional checkpoint system anyway, but without the immersion-breaking death and resurrection that usually comes with that, so it gets a thumbs up from me. This prioritization of immersion and consistency over traditional mechanics brings to mind Eco, which is surely not an accident. The dev team clearly drew some inspiration from that game, and this windmill scene in the village seems about as obvious a tribute as it's possible to get. That's right, every game with a windmill in it was inspired by Eco. So that does it for the core features of Jusant that are present from the beginning, but as in most games, as the player progresses, the devs pile more mechanics on top, with each chapter introducing a new wrinkle to the climbing. Unfortunately, most of these inclusions don't really add much new to the experience, and the game's second half is carried more by its environmental variety than by offering new gameplay scenarios. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and I want to repeat that I've remained thoroughly entertained throughout my first playthrough of Jusant, but a second playthrough reveals the weakness of these additional mechanics, and part of me wishes that the devs had doubled down on increasing the complexity of the climbing, because it feels like there's so much unused potential here. Now, I need to justify that statement, so let's get into exactly what these new mechanics are. The second chapter introduces this energy pulse ability, which causes certain nearby plants to react, either by growing up the wall or sprouting roots that can be climbed across. There's something incredibly satisfying about holding onto one of these blue plants and riding it upwards, but in all honesty, they have a very limited interactivity, and they just make climbing too easy, which is probably why they're mostly just used to quickly get you back to the main path after a diversion for a collectible. The problem here is that these plants are a simple one-way switch. You hit them with a pulse once, and that's it. They can't be interacted with again. If there were more options involved with these plants, like a second pulse causing them to detract again, or even some control over how they grow, then more complexity could have been drawn out of this mechanic. I'm reminded of Grow Home, and the fact that the player really is given direct control over the growth of the star plant that makes up the game's main objective. Combined with the totally freeform climbing across any surface, this means that there's no preset route through the game, and you're guaranteed to have a slightly different experience to every other player. The star plant takes on a unique shape that's influenced by you, as you cause it to grow by riding its flowers. So when you pull off an insane, sick, nasty jump with no parachute or safety net, it's totally unscripted, and so it feels seriously well-earned and rewarding. Compare that again to the plants and roots in Jusant, which are affected by your pulse ability in only one way, and it's plain to see which of these two games takes the prize for most complexity. Fortunately for Jusant, the roots are saved from total dullness by a mechanic that's added in the third chapter, involving heat and shadow, where your stamina will deplete more quickly while in direct sunlight. By itself, this mechanic doesn't bring much to the table, and on most climbs it can be completely ignored, but at the very least, it does encourage the player to be a bit more strategic with where they choose to rest their stamina while climbing, as it now makes more sense to wait until you're in the shade to do so. The most interesting consequence of the heat is that it causes roots to wither away after a few seconds, which is a nice interaction between mechanics that forces the player to plan ahead and get their timing right. I can't recall any other good examples of Jusant's mechanics interacting together like this, which is a shame because it's a compelling idea and it seems a good way of adding complexity to the game. In any case, I think there was room for a lot more experimentation with the heat and shade idea. Something like a moving patch of shade, or a way for the player to manipulate the environment and create some shade of their own, might have been some interesting avenues to explore. Also introduced in this chapter are the moving handholds known as pebbles, which come as a nice surprise when you first encounter them, but it quite quickly becomes apparent that interacting with them involves a lot of waiting and not a lot of interacting. Pebbles will stand still after being held for a short while, which I suppose was done in an attempt to make climbing over them more interesting, but I don't think it does. This is a case where combining them with another mechanic could have led to more interesting gameplay consequences, like if they preferred to avoid the heat and the player had to find or make a path for them through the shade. As it is now, the extent of most of your interactions with them is to hold the trigger and hope they walk in the direction you want them to, which I trust you'll agree leaves some room for improvement. Rounding off the extra mechanics of Jusant are the sparks from chapter 4 and the wind from the penultimate chapter, both of which have roughly the same effect of making you jump further. The sparks can be called to you and used to lift you into a higher jump, but considering that there's already a double jump move in the game, which feels like a more advanced and risky maneuver than using the sparks, I'm not really sure what the devs were going for with this. The whole idea is abandoned halfway through this chapter anyway, when it opens out into a huge cave and becomes more about swinging between these massive columns. And just to be clear, I thought this section was really visually inventive and I loved playing through it. But perhaps you can see what I mean when I say that it's the environments that carry the second half of Jusant rather than the mechanics. Finally, as I've already mentioned, the wind mechanic also aids the player in jumping further, and although it requires a bit of timing to execute correctly, I still don't think it contributes much to the game that wasn't already present elsewhere. Grow Up, the sequel to Grow Home, suffers from a similar problem. In that game you can scan plants and then regrow them anywhere you like to exploit their properties. But the issue is that they all do more or less the same thing. They launch you upwards. When the player already has access to a bouncy mushroom they can put wherever they like, what additional gameplay value are they getting when they find a bouncy leaf? Or, to return to Jusant, when a player has passed the halfway point of the game and is already comfortable executing a double jump, what's the value of introducing them to a new mechanic that does the same thing? I'd argue very little. So that's it for my roundup of Jusant's mechanics, and before moving on I think it would be worth summarising and nailing down the main themes of my criticism. There are two elements that I think could have used some more emphasis in Jusant: complexity and player freedom, and in many ways these two things go hand in hand. In terms of complexity, I've already made the argument that the mechanics added throughout Jusant aren't explored very deeply, but the real problem is that they don't give the player any additional options to go on top of their basic moveset. And the key word there is option. When you use a pulse here to summon some roots that you can climb across, that's not an option, it's mandatory. There's no other way to progress here, so it feels less like creative problem solving and more like completing an elaborate QTE. even more so because of the context-sensitive nature of the pulse ability. It's not an open-ended tool you can use to solve problems, it's just a switch you occasionally have to flip. You see the plant, you press the button. It's not exactly asking a lot from the player. I should say that I don't have anything against linearity, and I think it can actually be done quite well. In this scene there's also only one solution: to stick a piton into the rock, lower yourself down, and swing over to the ladder. But it still feels exciting to do it because you're not following a button prompt or using a context-sensitive ability. You're using the exact same controls that you have access to at all times to solve a problem whose precise configuration you haven't seen before, and there's something fundamentally satisfying about that. This is remarkably difficult to get across just through footage alone, because it really has to be played and experienced to be understood. But compare the scene I just mentioned to this one, which looks very similar, but with the key difference that the game screams in your face which button you should press. Context sensitivity rears its ugly head again and shatters all illusion of player freedom. The true linearity of the game is laid bare and you're back to feeling like you're playing an elaborate QTE. To compare once more with Grow Home, in that game you don't grab collectibles by walking up to them and pressing Y like you do in Jusant. You actually yank them out of the wall using the same controls you always use for climbing, which is so much more engaging than an intrusive button prompt. The dynamic nature of grabbing a crystal in Grow Home remains interesting until the end because it really is a little bit different every time, and I think there's a good lesson there. But anyway, there's nothing wrong in principle with the linearity of Jusant, and in fact a certain amount of linearity has a crucial role to play in providing teaching moments and giving the player a chance to learn the rules of a new mechanic in a restricted environment. After that learning has taken place though, there's the possibility of testing the player on what they've absorbed with a more free-form challenge, and sure enough, the parts of Jusant that I found most memorable were the more loose sections, where the training wheels come off and the player is given the responsibility to reach their goal using whatever methods they choose. These sections, though there are only a handful, mostly take the form of wide, flat walls covered in marching legions of pebbles, and despite my earlier complaints about the pebbles, I think they work well in this open arena in a way that they don't in more linear scenes. Their unpredictable movement prevents you from climbing to the exit in a straight line, while also providing enough options to let you improvise and use some ingenuity. When you reach your goal here, it feels like you really earned it through your own creativity, rather than following an obviously signposted route handed to you by the devs. Similarly, spotting an optional collectible in a hard-to-reach spot and then figuring out a way to get there is satisfying because it feels like there's no single intended solution, just you using your wits and knowledge of the game's mechanics to get there however you see fit. This is where I think complexity and player freedom go hand in hand. More complexity means more options for the player. More options means multiple ways of solving problems, which leads naturally to the player feeling that they have more freedom and more responsibility. I would even say that a certain amount of complexity is necessary for there to be any possibility of player freedom. When there's only a single viable solution, there's of course no real freedom. That feeling of freedom is sadly somewhat rare in Jusant, however, as the vast majority of the game is made up of the more linear type of challenge, following a path laid by the devs. And in fact, because most handholds are static and don't move like the pebbles do, Jusant is a fundamentally linear game at heart. Again, I want to be clear that this is not a bad thing. It's quite clearly what the devs were going for, and more importantly, it's well executed and very entertaining on a first playthrough. But I can't ignore that it's the free-form climbing sections that really stuck with me after I finished Jusant, and I see a mountain of potential here that's still left unexplored. While it may be left to a future game to pick up these ideas and carry them to the summit of that mountain, the fact that Jusant started moving in that bold new direction is one of the highest compliments I can give it. But that's enough talk of mechanics for one video, because Jusant, like so many games, is more than the sum of its mechanical parts, and I can't end my discussion of it without devoting some time to its setting, story and tone. There are a couple of interrelated narrative threads in Jusant, a direct one which is told bluntly to the player through cutscenes which take away control, and an indirect one which is actively discovered by the player as they hunt collectibles and clues during their journey. From the way I phrased that sentence, you can probably tell which of these I feel more positively towards. Woven together, these threads make up a Ghibli-esque parable about environmental devastation and the human responses to it. Generations after the tide went out and never returned, a single climber makes their way across the desert to reach the top of an abandoned tower and bring rain back to the parched landscape with the help of their friendly little beanbag sidekick. It's a simple tale, but there's enough world building and environmental storytelling to keep it interesting until the conclusion, and it's hard not to be a little bit moved by the first appearance of the flying water-filled ballast creature near the end, with the whole package being helped along by a great soundtrack and a sweeping main theme. To Jusant's credit, the cutscenes telling this story are few and far between, and for the most part are secondary to the actual gameplay, which the devs confidently trusted to be good enough to carry most of the experience, and this is the way it should be, in my humble opinion. As I hinted at a moment ago, however, it's the incidental and indirect storytelling that I find more compelling in Jusant. In the interactive medium of games, actively discovering a story for yourself is always going to be more interesting than being told one through cutscenes. For instance, from piecing together information from various leftover letters, bulletins and diary entries, it's possible to work out that the world of Jusant has stopped turning and the sun never moves in the sky, which is why its inhabitants now count time in sleeps rather than in days, an intriguing revelation that's never handed to you on a platter. The story of the tower you're climbing is written in the abandoned settlements you pass through on your way to the top. Dilapidated boats, anchors, moorings and other naval gear all sit rotting in the sun, and these remnants paint a surprisingly vivid picture of what these places might have looked like before the tide receded. The shell collectibles also help draw attention to these background details in a way that doesn't feel too obtrusive and gives some context to the environments, which is always appreciated. In fact, for a similar reason, the climb through the windmill village is one of the most enjoyable and memorable scenes in the game. I think largely because it feels like there's some justified context to the obstacles you're clambering over. There's a terrace where food was grown, a mill, and a cluster of buildings where people used to eat and drink, all of which contribute to the indirect environmental storytelling that I think suits this game so well. The spinning windmills in the penultimate chapter just don't hit the same, because they don't really tell any kind of story, and they feel abstract and gamey as a result. Another benefit of the more indirect method of storytelling is that it allows the player to experience a sort of personal narrative of their own, encountering problems and overcoming them through the innate desire to make it to the next ledge. A good point of comparison here would be Journey. A totally wordless and plotless experience, Journey is a stunningly beautiful game that can provide an emotional ride through gameplay alone. Fear, hope, joy, desperation, triumph, loneliness, all of these feelings can be evoked in a playthrough of Journey without a shred of narrative or character exposition. You might say that Journey is the gaming equivalent of non-representational visual art. The bridges and buildings you traverse aren't necessarily supposed to be taken as a literal place with a definitive backstory. They're simply there to facilitate gameplay and to create a mood that encourages the intended emotion. Likewise, even if there was no plot in Jusant at all, I think the feelings of tension, triumph and trepidation would still be a part of the experience conveyed by gameplay alone. But of course, Jusant does have a concrete story that it wants to tell alongside the intrinsic player-driven satisfaction of climbing and making progress for its own sake, and these competing priorities inevitably come into conflict, most notably at the end, where the story steps on the toes of the gameplay in a way that I found fundamentally unsatisfying. I'm sorry in advance for using this word, but in a ludic sense, Jusant is all about climbing higher, with the implicit goal of reaching the top of this impossibly high tower. So, when the penultimate chapter ends with a flying space whale carrying you to the summit for the ending, perhaps you can see why I find that such an anticlimax in terms of gameplay. It feels like the devs are trying to have their cake and eat it here. To put it another way, you spend the entire game climbing towards the peak, and then the devs just have an NPC do it for you at the last minute. I hope I don't need to explain why I find this disappointing. I can't help but imagine how triumphant and satisfying it would feel to finally plant your feet on the tower's summit after climbing all the way there with your own two hands. And I do have to imagine it, because that feeling is sadly absent from the ending of Jusant. So that brings me to the end of my thoughts on Jusant, and as usual I've ended up with a longer script than I expected to. There was a lot to dig into in the movement mechanics of this game, which is a great sign that the devs are onto something really strong here. Despite my moaning about the extra abilities leaving something to be desired, the principles of climbing are seriously impressive and are worth the price of admission alone. The main strength of Jusant as I see it is in those fundamentals, more specifically in how they're able to give the player some non-context sensitive options, like the ability to stick a piton into the wall wherever you choose. Even when there's still only one solution to a problem, freeform options like this mean that there's still a bit of flexibility and ambiguity in how the player reaches that solution, which feels a lot more rewarding and is something that I think most AAA games have missed in their implementations of climbing. When the player always has access to multiple tools with multiple uses, it raises the level of complexity of the whole game. Also, I hope it goes without saying by now that the fewer button prompts that have to be shown on the screen, the better. As for the weaknesses of Jusant, the main one for me is that it doesn't go quite far enough with this commitment to complexity, and almost all of the abilities added throughout the game are context sensitive, and don't really provide the player with new options. This means that the player quite quickly reaches the limits of understanding how these additional mechanics work, and as a result they have to be quickly abandoned and replaced with another superficially different one to prevent things getting stale. Giving these mechanics interesting synergies or ways of interacting with each other would go a long way to preserving a growing level of complexity throughout the entire game, which, as it currently stands, plateaus at around the halfway point. That's how I think Jusant could be improved as a game. As an experience, I would have liked to see it lean more into the indirect form of storytelling that I praised earlier, letting the player discover a narrative through exploration, and even to participate in a narrative of their own through the emotions born out of the gameplay. I want to play the version of Jusant which is one long uninterrupted climb from base to summit, with no loading screens and no cutscenes to break it up. This might be asking too much from a technical perspective, especially for an indie developer, but now that the concept has been proven, the floodgates for the climb 'em up genre are wide open for anyone to take a swing at it. Jusant has crested the hill and revealed the mountain of potential that stood behind it. Whoever tries to reach the top of that mountain has a long climb ahead of them, but thanks to Jusant, they won't be starting from scratch.
Jusant.
Jusant.
Jusant.